It's the gripe you hear from every college football fan outside of the Southeast, and sometimes from fans even within the region. SEC bias. Conventional wisdom in modern-day college football is that the sport and the people running it give preferential treatment to teams who are from the SEC. 3-loss Alabama getting into the 2025 college football playoff, 1-loss Alabama getting in 2023 over undefeated Florida State, the conference having 2 teams reach the CFP when it was just 4 teams twice over a 10-year period, Alabama getting a rematch with LSU in an all-SEC National Championship during the old BCS system back in 2011, and 2-loss LSU getting the nod to play in the 2007 BCS National Championship are all pieces of evidence that people making these assertions will bring up. Oh, and the majority of Heisman winners since 2007 are from the SEC. Voters are accused of subconsciously preferring the SEC because of their television exposure, and some claims are downright conspiratorial, including some idea of collusion given the league's own deals with ESPN, the same network that carries the CFP. But believe it or not, SEC bias is a relatively new phenomenon in the sport of college football. Perception was actually the opposite for a long time, and much more accurate. So what changed? How did this transition happen? Well, it really comes down to 2 games that occurred over 80 years apart. Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the rise of college football in the South and how the SEC became the nation's premier conference. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. As we trace the history of the SEC and Southern football in general, ironically, anti-SEC bias was the catalyst for what led to perceived SEC bias. A deep dive into awarded national championships, final rankings of Heisman winners from the beginning of the sport into the early part of the 2000s make it very clear that SEC programs operated for decades with the deck stacked against them before things changed. So how did that happen? To tell this story, we have to dive into the 2 most important games in Southern football history. Let's start on January the 1st, 1926, more than 7 years before the SEC had even formed. Alabama, under head coach Wallace Wade, faced off against Washington in the Rose Bowl. The Tide were 9-0, Southern Conference champions, and the first ever Southern team to be invited to Pasadena for the bowl game. At the time, the Rose Bowl was college football's only postseason game, and it had only been played 11 times, even though it dated back to 1902. Football was considered a gentleman's game in the Northeast and a blue-collar game in the Midwest and West. The point of the Rose Bowl was to invite the best team from the Northeast and the best team from the Midwest or West each year, highlighting the clash of styles. Southern football was considered significantly inferior, and it wasn't even without reason. To the old guard in the South, I'm talking about those who refused to reconcile with the North after the Civil War, football was considered a Yankee sport, one for out-of-touch elitists who never respected the Southern way of life. So many schools and fans outright rejected it. Early powerhouses in the region were all from elite academic institutions like Georgia Tech, Vanderbilt, and Tulane. That all changed in the 1920s, though, as the advent of new technology like radio made football more popular across the nation and in the South. There was a phrase during this time called the New South, in which a new generation of Southerners encouraged a further embrace of national cultures and trends to become more of a part of American life in general. Part of that modernization was falling in love with college football. The Rose Bowl committee only invited Alabama because schools who were supposed to represent the East that year all rejected it. Dartmouth was considered the best team in the nation, but the fans and players just didn't want to miss Christmas, so they turned it down. Colgate and Princeton rejected it for academic reasons. Even when the bowl committee did look south, they first invited Tulane, who was 9-0-1 in the Southern Conference, and also rejected it because of academics. So they were forced to settle on Alabama. Backlash was immediate. Far from just opposing Alabama's invite, national figures made jokes about just how badly Alabama would get blown out. Pop Warner himself said Washington was just too big, and entertainer Will Rogers went as far as to call them Tuscaloosers. Washington themselves didn't take the game seriously, deciding not to travel down to Pasadena until the day before. Wade, on the other hand, had his team arrive in Cali 3 weeks before the game and didn't allow for much sightseeing while they were there. He made it clear that this was a business trip. The plan paid off. Despite trailing 12-0 at halftime, Alabama caught Washington off guard with a dominant passing attack in the third quarter, which included 2 deep touchdown passes to halfback and bowl game MVP Johnny Mack Brown. This led to a shocking 20-19 upset by Alabama, and by them relying on the passing game to counter Washington's size, it was the birth of the stereotype that Southern speed is more valuable than Northern power. What nobody was prepared for was how much all the schools and football fans across the South paid attention to this matchup. This was the first Rose Bowl game to be broadcast on radio, so everybody from Louisiana to Florida listened to it. When the team made its trip back home on the train, they were greeted with legions of fans across all states of the old Confederacy who felt Alabama's victory was their victory. For many, this was a way to reclaim glory after losing the war. This is now known as the game that changed football in the South. Pride exploded and colleges everywhere upped their efforts to field competitive teams. But the game didn't do much to change perception of Southern football. Washington was considered an inferior team, and most people felt that any of the East Coast teams who rejected the invitation would have beaten them in a blowout. So anti-Southern bias continued. When the SEC was formed in 1933, anti-Southern bias was loosening up, but it was geared toward the Southwest and the Texas schools. So for the next 7 decades, anti-SEC bias was a thing. If we count going back to the year of the first AP Poll National Champion in 1936 and the first Coaches Poll National Champion in 1950, the SEC has had 11 teams finish with a perfect record by the time the final rankings came out without winning the national title in either of the major polls. Of the major conferences, and yes, we're including the old Big 8, Pac-12, and Southwest conferences in that, nobody else had 4. In fact, for the league's first 18 years of existence, from 1933 to 1950, 7 different teams had a perfect record when the final rankings came out, and not one of them ever finished atop those rankings. Tennessee was the first AP or Coaches Poll National Champion from the conference, winning both in 1951. That doesn't seem to suggest SEC bias the way people claim today. It's actually a pretty clear case for the opposite. This is something that carried into the 21st century, by the way. The era of official national champions began with the BCS in 1998, and Tennessee, yes, an SEC team, was the first to win it all. But did you know that the only team from a BCS or Power 5 conference to finish the season undefeated, not be on probation, and still not have a shot at the national title actually came from the SEC? That's right. 2004 Auburn finished 13-0 and never even got a chance to share the national title with USC, who went undefeated that year and later had to vacate the championship anyway. USC and Oklahoma, who was also undefeated, played for the title that season. Remember, it was still in the BCS era when only 2 teams could play for it all. If there was any SEC bias though, wouldn't Auburn have gotten the nod? Furthermore, would Auburn really be the only Power 5 team with the distinction of finishing the whole season undefeated and not having a shot at the national title in the BCS or college football playoff era? This one stat flies in the face of the SEC bias argument. But there's another. The year before, LSU won the BCS National Championship, but AP voters decided to rank USC number 1. It remains the only year a team who won the officially sanctioned national championship had to share it with somebody else. Oh, and if you think ESPN is somehow behind SEC bias, ask Tennessee fans about that. The most controversial Heisman race of all time was Michigan's Charles Woodson winning it over Peyton Manning in 1997, and Vol fans to this day firmly blame voters who worked at ESPN and had a Big Ten bias for that decision. In fact, before 2008, ESPN never had a deal with the SEC, and there was clear resentment from the ESPN ABC crew that the SEC was unique and carried its feature games on CBS each week. Speaking of the Heisman, the SEC has the only player to finish second in the Heisman voting to somebody who was on a team with a losing record. Johnny Majors, another former Vol, lost to Paul Hornung in 1956 despite Majors playing on a 10-0 team and Hornung's Notre Dame team going 2-8. And look, there was good reason for this anti-SEC bias for a while, to be fair. As we mentioned, most of the South rejected the legitimacy of football in the early 20th century, and in the mid-20th century, while the rest of college football was integrating, the SEC was openly hostile to it, with teams oftentimes refusing to play bowl games if the other team let a black player play. It took Bear Bryant scheduling USC in 1970 and knowing the Trojans would blow his Bama team out, which they did 42-21 with the fully integrated team, to get Alabama fans and boosters on board with integration. Things like that happened across the South. Of course, voters wouldn't favor all-white SEC teams over integrated teams elsewhere, oftentimes with black players from the South. Still, Manning's Heisman snub, along with LSU's and Auburn's controversies in 03 and 04, came well after that. Even in the 1980s, Auburn and Tennessee each had one-loss seasons in which they couldn't claim national titles, despite the national title winners both years also having one loss. Simply put, for the first 70 years of the league's existence, every bit of evidence possible pointed to anti-SEC bias. So again, what changed? Well, if the 1926 Rose Bowl was the game that made football relevant in the South, another bowl game 81 years later would be the one that launched the SEC's takeover of the sport. In 2006, 2 years after Auburn was egregiously left out of the title game, another BCS issue emerged. Florida was 12-1 and SEC champions, their one loss coming by 10 on the road to Auburn earlier in the season. Michigan was 11-1, but their only loss was by 3 on the road to Ohio State, who was number 1 and the only undefeated team in college football. Debate raged over which team should get the nod to play Ohio State in the national championship game. Florida had the number 1 ranked strength of schedule that year, they had one extra win, and they won their conference. On the other hand, Michigan was more dominant in all of their games, and again, their only loss was to the other team who would be going to the title game, one who hadn't lost all year. They had also played an undefeated Ohio State team a lot closer than Florida had played a 2-loss Auburn team in their loss. If Florida didn't get in, though, the theory of anti-SEC bias would have gone into overdrive given the Auburn debacle 2 years earlier. Lee Corso even said on a college football ESPN special that voters may consider putting Florida in over Michigan just to make up for how Auburn was treated in 2004. By the way, on that same show, Kirk Herbstreit, who many now accuse of SEC bias, was very vocal in his defense of Michigan, saying they should get in over Florida. So much for SEC bias from Kirk Herbstreit.
It's just my opinion after watching Michigan, the way they played against Ohio State in Ohio Stadium, the number 1 team in the country, that they are deserving of being the number 2 team.
Anger was reaching boiling point in the South that this was even a debate. It seemed plain to everyone in SEC country that Florida, by winning their conference and having not yet had a shot against Ohio State, was the more deserving team. A perceived PR campaign by the SEC and Urban Meyer, who wasn't silent about his Florida team deserving to get in, may have been what swung it. The Gators received the number 2 ranking over Michigan by the smallest margin possible, as the two were even tied in the BCS computer rankings. So Florida would play for the national championship, while Michigan would be relegated to the consolation Rose Bowl. Then the games happened. Michigan lost to USC in a blowout, fairly quickly proving they didn't belong. A week later, in spite of all the backlash and all the national media saying they didn't deserve to be in the game, Florida entered the most important game for the South since the Alabama win over Washington 80 years earlier. Like that 1926 Rose Bowl, every Southerner had stake in the game. This time, they were all Florida fans. Also like the 1926 game, the Southern team was a heavy underdog that wasn't considered worthy of playing in the game. And like the 1926 game, the Southern team won. Unlike the 1926 game, though, Florida didn't just win. It wasn't a thriller at all. Florida won a blowout, 41-14. Speed and defense were the self-described brands of SEC football at that point, and those claims were validated in this game at the expense of Ohio State quarterback Troy Smith, who had won the Heisman because of his dual threat abilities. The Gators sacked Smith 6 times and held him to 4 of 14 passing for just 35 yards. It was utter humiliation, one that made it impossible to ignore Florida was in a different class. That year, Florida lost to an SEC team by 10 points and won 2 SEC games by just 1 point each, but they could blow out the number 1 team in the nation from the Big Ten by 4 touchdowns. Gator defensive end Jarvis Moss made the key comment on behalf of the SEC after the game. He said, quote, "Honestly, we've played better teams. I can name 4 or 5 teams in the SEC that could probably compete with them and play the same type of game we did against them." That quote was the biggest bit of salt in the wound, and going forward, it would make it impossible for the nation to ignore the SEC. But while this game was the catalyst for SEC bias, the league just kept having to earn its reputation. A year later, by default, LSU became the first ever 2-loss team to play for the national title. Nobody could dispute it, though. On the Saturday before the final BCS rankings came out, two one-loss teams ahead of them, Missouri and West Virginia, lost their conference title games. That left two one-loss teams, Ohio State and Kansas, and an undefeated team in Hawaii. Hawaii was a mid-major, so they weren't going to the title game no matter what, and Kansas was 11-1 but failed to even play for the Big 12 title and didn't have one win against a team that was in the final top 25 rankings before the bowl games. That left 10 two-loss teams, 2 of whom were mid-majors, and 3 of whom didn't win their conference. LSU got the nod barely over Virginia Tech, USC, Oklahoma, and West Virginia because of their schedule strength and the fact that both of their losses came in overtime. So at least within regulation, they hadn't lost a game all year. Once again, though, they proved they were in a different class, as an SEC team blew out number 1 Ohio State in the national championship game for a second straight season, with LSU beating them 34-14. Georgia, for what it's worth, beat Hawaii 41-3, so SEC teams finished number 1 and number 2. The year before, they finished number 1 and number 3. A year later, Florida won its second national title in 3 years by beating Oklahoma, and after that 2008 season, ESPN inked a long-term deal with the SEC worth over $1 billion, a record at the time, and the league still was able to keep its premier games being played on CBS. It's at this point that the conspiracies behind SEC bias began to heat up, as they were the largest investment for 2 major networks. But before that point, you couldn't ignore 3 straight national championships. Beyond the titles, the SEC was also in the midst of 3 straight years with the most NFL draft picks, a streak that is now at 19 years, and the league was 5-0 in BCS title games while every other conference was at or below 500. Simply put, they were delivering every time they got the nod into the major game. With that deal in place, Alabama won it all in 2009 with the win over Texas. Auburn won it all in 2010 with the win over Oregon. Neither of those matchups was considered controversial. But then came 2011, and the SEC became the benefactor, I would argue, for the first time ever, of a truly controversial title matchup. Alabama had gone 11-1 and lost to number 1 LSU at home, who had finished 13-0. Oklahoma State had also finished 11-1 and won the Big 12. If the BCS was to apply the standard it applied in 2006 to get Florida the nod, many felt Oklahoma State should have gotten the nod over Alabama just for consistency purposes. However, Alabama got a shot at a rematch with LSU in the national title game. The Tide won that game 21-0. It was the first matchup that had fans screaming SEC bias, and the 2006 standard to get Florida in being turned on its head was the biggest piece of evidence. The matchup was the final straw for college football officials, and they finally agreed to move to a playoff in 2014. Now, in 2024, with the outbreak of the expanded 12-team CFP, the SEC and Big Ten becoming super conferences with 16 and 18 teams respectively, and ESPN ABC getting exclusive rights to both the SEC and every CFP game, the conspiracies were naturally going to increase. And in 2025, with 5 SEC teams in the CFP making up nearly half the field, it got a lot harder to argue against them. Alabama became the first 3-loss team to make the CFP after losing the SEC championship game in a blowout. The committee didn't drop Alabama after that spot at all, making the claim that playing a conference title game shouldn't count against teams in favor of a team that doesn't play one. At the same time, though, they dropped BYU for losing the Big 12 title game in a blowout to Texas Tech, moving Miami and Notre Dame, who didn't play, ahead of them, and making Miami the final at-large CFP team. Since ESPN ABC hold exclusive rights over ACC games as well, where Miami resides, the committee looked at 4 teams on the bubble for 2 spots and just so happened to pick the 2 teams whose TV rights are exclusively owned by the network that carries the CFP, using contradictory logic to do so. There's no way to ignore that. We'll see what the future holds for the CFP and the conferences in general, but in all honesty, before 2025, the data for SEC bias didn't hold up. Even in 2024, they only put 3 SEC teams in the CFP and 4 Big Ten teams, and they could have used screwy logic to put Alabama in over SMU that year, but they didn't. Still, there's no doubt about the 180 with SEC treatment over the past 2 decades, and it all comes down to that 1926 Rose Bowl and 2007 BCS National Title game. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Would you say that the historical nature of college football justifies SEC bias? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.